We've got some people joining. Really excited to have you. We're up to 21 so far. The numbers are climbing. My name is Casey Spain. I am the Marketing and Communications Senior Manager for American Pets Alive and Human Animal Support Services. And I wanted to welcome you all to this incredible webinar that we're about to have. We are going to talk about overcoming legal barriers about community cats. And this is a live Q&A. So some of you have submitted questions so far, and some of you have not yet. If you have questions about things that are being talked about, feel free to jump in and talk about those things in the chat. We're excited to have those questions come in from you. You can also hit the Q&A feature and submit a question that way as well. If we'll just take a couple of seconds and you all tell me where you're from, we would love to have you in the chat and see where everyone is coming to us from. We're up to 87 participants right now. So just go ahead and chat and tell us what cities you're from and states, maybe even countries. Wow. New York, Hawaii, Los Angeles, New Mexico. And if you can't tell, I'm at an animal shelter right now, and that's why you're hearing a lot of dog barking, and I apologize for that. I love all of this. This is awesome. So many people, over 91 people are participating right now on this call. This is great. I'd love to introduce our esteemed panelists that we have today. I have cat-tastic expert, Monica Frenden-Tarant. She is the Maddie's Director of Feline Lifesaving. Thanks to Maddie. And we are also joined today by Richard Angelo, Jr. He's the legislative attorney for Best Friends Animal Society. So glad to have you both. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and I'll just let you guys take it from here.
Thank you so much, Casey. My name is Monica Frenden-Tarant, and I'm so happy to be with you guys tonight. The numbers, our participants are still clicking up. And before we went live, Richard and I were just talking about how humbled we are that so many people are tuning in to all these cat webinars, and that we've all felt like, many of you on this call probably, like we've been the cat people in the back of the room or on the rooftop shouting about cats and cat issues and unnecessary cat deaths in our industry for so long, and people are finally hearing us. We have over 400 people registered for this call. That makes Richard and I feel really good. We're so humbled and happy to be here tonight. And we are going to talk about community cats, one of the programming changes that can have the biggest impact on saving the lives of cats in your communities. And I'm really excited for this because I got to know Richard on the Haas Community Cat Working Group, and he is a legislative attorney with Best Friends. And I started out in this industry as one person in the middle of rural Illinois trying to do community cat work. And I would have killed for this opportunity way back then, years ago, to sit down and have my questions answered personally by an attorney specializing in this kind of work. So I hope that you guys find this as fascinating as I do. And this is really an unprecedented opportunity to just have an open forum and get your questions answered by an expert in this field. So I'm super humbled to be here. I want to let Richard introduce himself for a couple minutes, and then we're going to go down some questions that you guys have all submitted to us ahead of time. But if you come up with questions as we go, if you haven't had time to submit yours yet, use the chat feature. We want to be just low key and interactive and fun. We don't have a presentation prepared because we just want to answer your specific questions and make sure you walk away from this with what you need. So don't hesitate to use that chat or that Q&A feature, and make sure that you get your question in for Richard and I tonight. So want to take it, Richard, before we jump in?
Sure. Like, I want to echo everything that Monica just said about being humbled and all of you taking time out of your evening or late afternoon to join us on this. We've been screaming from the rooftops forever now about saving cats and in our shelters and in our communities across the country. And it's really, really humbling to see so many people interested in wanting to do this. I've been a legislative attorney with Best Friends Animal Society since 2015. And primarily my work at Best Friends deals with our community cat programming and community cat programming all across the country. I do need to mention, very, very lawyer-like, and it'll probably be the only time I will, is I am only licensed in the state of Michigan as an attorney, but I do work in all 50 states. Basically, I like to call it risk analysis when I am talking to folks. to say, we're taking a look at these ordinances, we're taking a look at the laws that apply to community cats or could apply to community cats, and providing, here's what might happen, here's what could happen, here's what I would be doing, kind of thing. So keep that all in mind as you give your questions tonight. But I'm really, really excited to see what questions we're going to be getting and how many people want to participate in this. It's very exciting for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love that questions are already coming in. So let's just get right to it, Richard. Would you tell us what you think the top 3 legal challenges are that we're facing with community cats right now, and what kind of national strategy is ongoing to overcome them?
Sure. I'm going to be kind of general at first because, you know, these things kind of change, and there's always the hot button issues as we go. But the first thing that always comes to mind when I'm dealing with looking at community cat laws or policies that might be dealing with community cats in a community is the age of these laws and the perception that comes along with them. Many, many, many of the laws that might apply to community cats across the country, whether it be at the local, county, or state level, they were drafted so long ago. They weren't really thinking about nowadays community cat programming that we're dealing with, and didn't even have that kind of thing in mind. And legislators, courts, lawyers, everybody are trying to figure out how do we apply it to community cats nowadays. And sometimes they're not doing a very good job of it, or they're being extra careful in very lawyerly fashion to try and err on the side of caution, which is a bad way of saying it, but that's essentially what they're doing. And that's the first, I think, the biggest challenge that we're facing. With that, the second thing I would say is the misperception that comes along with the age of those laws. Specifically, the things that come to mind are when we're talking about definition terms, like the definition of owner. When we're talking in whether it be in a local ordinance, they define an owner as someone who feeds a cat for more than 3 days or more than 10 days, whatever it might be. You got to try and figure out, how is that going to apply to your community cat program? Is it even, it's not even in the English definition of what we would normally think an owner would be, right? So with under that type of definition, a cat could have 5, 6, 7, 10 owners if they were being fed and making the rounds in their community. So it's trying to figure out where these laws might apply and what misperceptions with the common usage of the language that is being applied in those laws are going to be, where is it going to be applied to these community cat programs? Another one that goes along, and I know we have several questions about this, but abandonment, it comes up a lot. It's usually in the state statute. And most of those statutes were written so very long ago. They weren't even thinking about, hey, we have this cat that we feed all the time. We want to get it sterilized, vaccinated, and put it back where it goes so it can't reproduce and it's healthier. Those laws would not certainly apply to those situations in anybody's common sense realm of thinking. So I can't wait to have those discussions as we go, but those misconceptions, I think, are one of the things that is the second thing that we're dealing with nationally. We hear it in every state. It's not unique to California. It's not unique to Georgia, Florida, or anywhere else. The third thing is the opposition to community cat programming. We're doing, as an animal welfare industry, if we want to call it that, we're doing a stupendous job at the local level nationally. We're doing very, very well at reaching out to our local leaders, our local shelters, the rescue groups who are dealing in the local communities. We're doing a great job of implementing community cat programming and laws, policies that support community cat programming. The problem is that the opposition realizes that we're beating them at that game. And they're starting to get a little wise to it. We're starting to see more lawsuits regarding state level laws that may or may not apply to community cats. In most cases, they don't. We're starting to see the use of environmental laws in some cases, and environmental policies, basically regulatory procedures. We see it in Hawaii a lot with habitat conservation plans that are out there. They get drawn up, and some of these local communities have to abide by them, where they include community cats saying they can't be on the landscape. It's one of these things where they're starting the opposition, whether it be environmental groups or people who don't like the return of friendly cats to communities, whatever it might be. They're starting to use higher level tools at their disposal that we may not be paying attention to on a regular basis as we are at the local level. We've been doing so good at that, and our focus has been there. We need to start shifting our focus just a little bit to be able to see where that's coming from.
We've gotten a lot of questions about abandonment tonight, so Richard has assured me we are going to get to them, especially your California folks on the call. Richard is well aware of the statute that you're talking about, so we are definitely going to get to that. But that's part of the amazing work that we're doing at both of our organizations with Human Animal Support Services and Best Friends, is working on those national models and working on collaborative efforts to increase the work that we can do and replace some of those old laws when necessary. Okay, let's jump into your questions. Well, we're going to give Richard a softball one, and they're going to get increasingly harder because we like to terrorize him a little bit. Richard, how do you know what your local laws pertaining to community cats are, or if a community cat or TNR ordinance already exists? How do people know if they're operating in the law or outside of the law?
If you want to know, one of the places, if you're looking for an online resource for that, I rely on MuniCode a lot. There's another website called QCode that people use several times as well. You can look up your local ordinances on those places. Sometimes you might be able to find it at your county website, your city website, to be able to find where the ordinance is. You usually just have to look up the animal control ordinance in your local jurisdiction online. You can also call your county clerk, your local city clerk, ask them for a copy of the ordinance. They usually will have no problem giving it to you, and you can take a look through and see how it applies. I also recommend folks always reach out to your local animal shelter, ask them how are they applying the law, what are they doing? Because it's one thing to sit down and read a bunch of words that, 20 pages that lawyers don't have a clue about community cat program you may have wrote 30 years ago. It's another thing to talk to the folks who are on the ground doing the work in your community every day to see how they're actually applying that law and what their perception of it is.
And God knows that we are well aware of how many community cat advocates are operating in the dark or in the shadows under the cloak of darkness. We all have done it. Lots of us are still doing it. But that leads us into the next really good question. And I get this all the time, and I know it's one of Richard's hot button topics too. I get all the time, we need an ordinance. We need an ordinance. We must have an ordinance to protect our cats and to allow us to do these work. So the next question ties in nicely. Do local laws or ordinances need to be in place for a successful and effective community cat program to exist? Do folks need to have one in order to do this work?
And Monica kind of hit it right on the head. This is a super hot button issue with me and several of my colleagues. It's just, I will always tell you, and I'm a lawyer, I'm going to always tell you sometimes the best thing is to not have anything addressing cats, because it gives you the discretion to continue to do whatever you want to do in the proper way, using best practices and without any unintended consequences that may be present or interpreted into those ordinances and or laws that you might be looking for. So most definitely not. You certainly do not need a law in order to enable it. If the law doesn't prevent it, it's the exact same thing, and you're allowed to basically implement a program that can work the way it's supposed to work without the restrictions that the law might put in place purposefully or unintended wise.
So Richard and I are both in Michigan, and we've got, what is it, the 1948 dog law of Michigan? Is that what we've got going on?
1918.
1918, even older. And it basically, correct me if I'm wrong, I know you will, that says like shelters don't have to pick up cats or do anything at all with them, right?
Right,
So
right.
it's kind of
That's absolutely correct in Michigan, yeah.
yeah, and we get this all the time. Like that's our gut reaction is often, that's terrible. We need a law that says blah blah blah. And Richard and I both go, no, leave it, be quiet.
Yeah.
Things are fine, because that means that we don't have to impound and thus euthanize them, and there's nothing stopping us from doing TNR, right?
Yep, nothing stopping us here. In fact, there are some really, really good programs going on in the state of Michigan, all across the state in different areas. And they're, as we all know, nobody does it the same way. Exactly the same way, I should say. So they're all able to work freely within their own jurisdictions, within their local ordinances. Obviously, that might apply, but they're able to implement these programs without any restrictions from the state. In fact, I don't even think cats in Michigan aren't even required to be rabies vaccinated, although we do that anyway.
Yeah. So you'll often hear both of us saying all the time, sometimes the best ordinance in the world is no ordinance.
Yeah.
So if we don't have to have one in order to do community cat programming, one of the next questions says, when is it beneficial to push for an ordinance then? When would it be a good time to say, okay, now we do need an ordinance?
When there are restrictions that you just simply can't overcome, that maybe policies at the animal services level that you just simply cannot overcome. If you need an ordinance in that situation, you go to your local policymakers, your officials, whether it be your city council, your county board, and talk to them about it. I mean, have a conversation about it. Why are we doing this? Why are we not? Why are we preventing it? And certainly when it's being done by private groups, if private groups are being prevented from implementing a TNR program or continuing with a TNR program based upon some either perceived or just simple belief in from the Animal Services Agency, that it's something where you simply have to go over their head. I think education also is a big part of it. Like I said, I always start the conversation at the shelter level. And why are we doing it? What's the reason for it? There are so many, even the National Shelter Group, National Animal Care and Control Association came out last year with their statement in favor of community cat programming. It's a wave across the country where we have all of these experts and all of this information available to us, where we can take it to, whether it be our local shelter, our local policymakers, in order to be able to implement the programming that we need. And if that requires an ordinance or some sort of written policy, so be it. If that's what the Animal Services Agency is going to require, or the local policymakers are going to require.
Yeah, so it's kind of what I'm telling people, and what it sounds like you're saying is, if there's no barriers in your way whatsoever legally, full steam ahead. And
Sure.
by the time, if you do hit a barrier, frankly, that allows what's going on nationally behind the scenes, all the work that all the animal welfare organizations are doing, more time to keep compiling position statements or overturning icky legislation or outdated legislation. So no barriers in place. You can absolutely and should full steam ahead with your community cat programming. And in the meantime, it's allowing us to play catch up behind the scenes a little more as we go.
Sure, and you're able to see the weaknesses and the arguments that are made against it as you go along as well. If people are bringing up the abandonment issue or bad feeding, that kind of thing, you're able to take that information in, and if there is a problem, fix it, right? Whether or not, if you do have a problem with people feeding in an improper manner or in a way that causes a problem, you're able to address those issues behind the scenes and not have to deal with whether it be citations and court appearances and all that kind of thing.
All right, you touched on our next question, and this one goes out to all of our folks from California who tuned in. Is it legal to have a policy prohibiting feeding community cats on private property, so like an apartment complex, if you live in a city with no feeding bans and where cats are allowed to legally roam free?
Unfortunately, if it's on the property of the private apartment complex or condo association, that sort of thing, there's no real good fix for that. Yes, they're able to prevent it on their private property. They're able to do that whether or not, because they control their own property. It would be the same thing as whether or not you're feeding in your neighbor's backyard and didn't ask your neighbor, or the neighbor doesn't want you feeding in her backyard. So unfortunately, that's a pretty quick answer to that one. And there's no real good fix to it other than building that relationship, talking to them about the benefits of it, and working within whatever constraints, if they're reasonable, to be able to do what you want to be doing with the community cats there.
I'm going to jump over to the Q&A because this is all kind of right on topic about what we're all doing, again, in the cloak of darkness to save lives of cats when we're faced with these challenges. So our friend Margaret throws out a good question that I know a lot of you on this call are familiar with. We've got entire state laws like Kansas that require shelters to euthanize feline leukemia positive cats, even if they're healthy. So Margaret is asking, besides outright breaking such laws, what can people do to bend the laws or get around them to help save the lives of cats like that?
Very specific to that law in the state of Kansas, I'm very familiar. They just lifted, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, the FIV restrictions. They were not allowing FIV cats to leave the shelter alive either. And it's based upon interpretation of a statute and put into regulation. So there's a real problem there. And it's one of the last states, if not the last state, that has that restriction. So there's no mandate that you have to do the testing. So, you know, if they're putting that expense out there to be able to do the testing, maybe they want to try and expend those resources elsewhere. Other than that, it's trying to change that law. And I know there are efforts every single year to try and change the way that's interpreted and what's going on there in Kansas, but unfortunately, they haven't been successful yet.
Does Alaska still have their statewide ban on free roaming cats?
I think it depends on how you look at it. There's some you know,
all of the laws, yeah.
If I remember right, and I'm sure if Peter Wolf is on this call, he's just laughing behind the screen because Alaska has a regulation which within the Fish and Game, I believe it is, code that, or regulations that say you cannot return certain animals to the wild, and cats are included within that in some places. I know there's TNR going on in Alaska. Some shelters are certainly hesitant to do it. I know there are some efforts going on right now, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the hearings are coming up in the spring of 2022 on changing those regulations. Whether or not they'll be successful, I'm not quite sure, but yes, that is held up as a barrier in Alaska quite often, but I know that there are groups up there doing it.
There's a whole lot of people bending a whole lot of rules and laws. Everyone on this call is certainly doing it. I feel like we're setting Richard up a little bit with these questions because he's going to say, I can't tell you to break the law, but we're going to keep throwing them at him anyway. How do you go about trapping at a location where the homeowner doesn't want you trapping? He's threatening to call the cops on me, but since TNR is technically not legal, but they also consider abandoning the cat, releasing the cat to be in abandonment, I don't know what else to do. So how do we go about sneakily trapping cats where we maybe aren't supposed to be trapping cats? I don't know if there's a legal answer to this besides be quiet and under the cloak of darkness.
Yep. You guys are going to start throwing me out of here. Because it's going to, I mean, unfortunately, from a legal standpoint, quote unquote, legal standpoint, there was a lot in that question. So the trapping portion, if your neighbor doesn't want you trapping on their property or feeding on their property, then you know, there's not a whole heck of a lot that you can do. I know that there are ways around it. as far as where you set your trap, maybe if you don't have a fence, or you share a hedgerow or something like that, if you get my drift. But legally, there's not a whole heck of a lot you can do other than be very, very nice to your neighbors and explain and educate to them how this benefits those cats. Obviously, I would presume it's not your neighbor's cat that you're trying to trap. So maybe if we can educate in a productive way, that's going to be the best solution to that situation. And that goes right along with the apartment complex, the condo association, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many cats I trapped on my side of the fence or property line for just that exact reason. And I, knock on wood, have never been caught doing that, but you know, I don't know that there's anything legally to be done about that. Even if I was caught, if the cat was on my property or public property, it's private property that we're supposed to technically stay off of, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And this, unfortunately, I mean, I don't want to get way down into the weeds. It goes both ways, right? If someone is doing that and doesn't have good intentions for those cats and has it on the other side of the property line, I always tell folks, because I get this question a lot, they're trapping my cats from my colony. And sometimes you know, is it legal? Is it not legal for the trapping portion? Usually it's not illegal. If you're doing it on your own property and setting the trap on your own property and trapping those cats, it's not technically illegal. It's what you do after, right? Where those cats go. Are they going to the shelter, or what are you doing with the cat? Or are you taking it to the local park and dumping it there? Because I know that occurs on occasion with folks who don't want cats around or see it as a nuisance having cats in their backyard. So it goes both ways there, and we have to be very, very careful. That's why having conversations is having those conversations with your neighbor, with your apartment complex, with your condo association is so key, and being able to educate them.
So this one is two-part. It comes from our Q&A, and you're going to love it. So I think so far that I've gleaned, Richard's favorite question in the world is, can you give me a model ordinance? And it's going to lead to this next question. But will you talk about why you absolutely, you scold us whenever we throw this at you? Can you give me a model ordinance?
Yeah, I am definitely not a fan of model ordinances. It varies so often. From one area to the next, one community to the next, one state to the next. So you are dealing with state laws that may apply, say, in California, and you're trying to work your animal services or animal control ordinance at the local level to fit how those state laws work into it, right? So what you might do in California is not going to work even in Nevada, the neighboring state. So I do believe in model provisions. So definitional terms, and certainly, I mean, one of the most important things is, just for example, that I always throw up, unowned community cats. They have to be unowned in the definitional terms, and there's numerous reasons for that. Primarily, a lot of the rabies vaccination requirements require owners at the state level to revaccinate their cats. Sometimes that's one way to get around the revaccination requirements, or at least have a good argument against it. So, but yes, I do not believe in model ordinances, although, I mean, Alley Cat Allies has been doing it for how long now, and I think they have one posted on their own website. So, and they've been very, very successful doing it. So
you talked about model provisions are good. Would you, as we keep talking about abandonment and it's affecting so many organizations across the country, what are your thoughts on throwing in the verbiage of community cat programming shall not be construed as abandonment? Is that something wise? Not wise?
Again, it probably depends on your jurisdiction. Most of those abandonment provisions are in your state law. So whether or not your local agency is able to enforce state law, if you put it in the local ordinance, all it's really going to do is draw some sort of question in the locality where you're at. One of the things that has been done in the past, and I want to point this out, and I'll get everyone the link however I'm supposed to do, because the American Bar Association a few years ago passed a resolution, and this is a bunch of lawyers. It's the national, the National Lawyers Group that basically endorsed trap, neuter, vaccinate, return programs. And when they did that, basically what the statement said was to enact and interpret current laws in order to be able to benefit and continue the community cat programs if you're working them in your localities. That's one of the things you have to take a look at. Those laws that may not have been interpreted by a court yet, the abandonment laws. You're probably hard pressed to find any of those abandonment laws that have ever gone in front of a court on a TNR program. In fact, there's probably not any in the whole country, with the exception of a few pending right now. So if a court's not interpreted that way, your animal services, your local police department, whoever is doing the enforcement of those laws, has the ability to interpret them as they see fit. So educating them, providing them with the resource that the American Bar Association put out, it is a really, really good first step, because the first thing you're going to do is go to their city attorney or their county attorney and say, what do you guys think?
So all of that has kind of led to Alexander's question that I'm going to jump in here with, where we started talking about model ordinances or templates and whatnot. So Alexander is asking, is there a good template or legal phrase for housing agreements or contracts that require all pets to be spayed and neutered to reduce the population if they get lost or abandoned? How do you feel about templates or legal phrases for housing agreements or contracts requiring everybody to be spayed and neutered?
I'm not sure I understand a housing agreement. What?
I'm assuming like a rental agreement.
Oh, to have your animal spayed or neutered.
This has kind of been talked about quite a bit in animal welfare, but it's one of those myths I think that still is pervasive about, we just need a law that says everyone's required to have their animals spayed and neutered, and then all these animals won't exist anymore.
Yeah,
right? I think that's kind of where this is going, and we've debunked that so many times, but I would love to hear your take on it.
It's one of the, all of my animals are spayed and neutered. I totally believe in it. I believe there also has to be the resources out there to be able to make that happen. And as so many people know, we're dealing with veterinary issues all across the country right now. And am I going to make someone not have a house because their cat, dog, whatever it is that they may just have adopted and want to move into a home, tell them they can't have it here because they can't get a veterinary appointment to spay or neuter that animal? I'm not really in favor of that, to mandate it anyway. I'm in favor of the concept, absolutely. We have to do it. It is absolutely crucial, and we all know that on this call. But mandating it is a different story unless you're providing the resources for them to do it in some way, form, or fashion.
Yeah, we've got lots and lots of studies that have been out on the books those kind of like punitive measures, we're gonna force you to do X, Y, and Z, and being punitive about it don't work. We know that people don't have animals spayed and neutered because of lack of resources to get it done, or lack of, whether that's access to care or lack of funding. And so penalizing that has been shown not to work. So, we crossed this bridge in Austin many years ago where Austinites wanted to enforce a spay neuter a law, and we know that it doesn't work. But so I don't think that we have a model template or legal phrase to say that you must have your animal spayed and neutered to do X, Y, and Z. I think if we're asking about if we're going to spay and neuter it at impound and then release it, I think that's entirely different. That's an animal control SOP or policy or protocol.
Exactly.
But I don't know that I would have anything, or I'm sure there's some instance, but I'm hard pressed to come up with something that's like, you must have it spayed and neutered to do it, and here's a contract enforcing that. I can't think of.
Yeah, I'm sure there are housing agencies, whether it be, apartment housing association, the nationwide, they all have model contracts. They're not making these stuff up, this each up as they go. There are model contracts out there, and I think several of them probably have the language that you're looking for out there. Just because it's not something that It's not something that comes up very often, at least in my line of work, that I'm able to point to a resource on that.
Yeah.
Or a specific one.
So we're a little over half of our way through, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit. And lots of people are asking, and I think this is a really, really good question. What are some strategies that are proven to work in less progressive areas to persuade local governments to consider community cat programming? Especially if the municipality is not kicking in any funding for programs like this. How do we incentivize them to be supportive, to help fund community cat programmings? How do we start convincing our local government and stakeholders and policymakers that this is the way forward?
Well, first and foremost, if it's at the policymaker level, at the local level, get to know your local, who's your local city council person, who is your county board person, who represents you. Introduce yourself, talk to them about it, talk to them about the benefits of it. We've done so many different programs across the country where we call them pilot programs, right? Where we're putting them in place, where we're able to convince local officials to say, okay, you don't want to do it through the whole city. Let's start it in this one neighborhood, and show you that it works. And usually you have to have some sort of private partner to be able to do that. A local TNR group, a local humane society who's wanting to actually do the boots on the ground work and show them how it works so that they will want to kick in money in the future. One of the best things you can show them is how they're going to be able to save money and shift resources, right, in the long run. As you show them that these programs work, less cats from a particular zip code or a particular neighborhood are coming into the shelter, or there are less nuisance calls that their animal services officers have to go out and respond to. All of those things. You have to compile the information, get it to your policymakers, and advocate for those programs. And even if you have to start small, you can always be able to grow that program as you go. Local communities across the country are struggling with funds as they go through COVID and other issues in the last couple of years. So you certainly don't want them, you don't want to come right out and ask them to spend more money if you don't have to. But we'd love it if they did, right? Some of the other places that they do, I do know in Michigan, one of the big things that we do, and I've seen it in other states, there are special millages. That's a tax on people, but it's also one that a lot of people don't see sometimes. If you can be able to fund certain areas. I know in certain areas of Texas, they also have spay and neuter vouchers that they offer. For at the city level, there's city level in the budgets that come through. So there are a lot of different ideas and models, excuse me, across the country that you're able to try and go to these local officials and show them, here's how it's going to work. And that's even if you have to have it at a smaller level to begin with. Showing them that it works is probably key for those who aren't going to understand it. And if you can't show them boots on the ground how it works, be prepared to come to them with local communities similar to yours that have already implemented these programs and show how those have worked. You've got to have some communities in your state. Community cat programming goes on in every single state across the country. So you're able to find those examples and be able to relate it to your local region. I will tell you, people in North Carolina probably don't care what's going on in California or Oregon or Washington. So you have to be able to localize it as best you can and show how it's being done successfully in other areas.
That's so true. I can't tell you how many times someone has said to me, well, that's in Austin. So it's really important to find a sister community that your elected officials can relate to. That's your size, your demographic, your political affiliation, as alike as humanly possible. So they can't say, well, we're not Austin.
That's probably a great example, because obviously Austin has had success and a lot of people want to point to it, but they're going to say that's Austin, that's not Lubbock.
I love when we get to answer live questions because they always take us in different directions than I was anticipating. fascinating. And I find this one fascinating because we hear this all the time. People are asking in the chat, Bonnie and Vicky are both asking in the chat questions about animal cruelty and people doing nefarious things to their cats. We've got business owners who are poisoning them. Someone is trapping them and they don't return. They're being assumed we're drowning them. We're doing something terrible to the cats. What legal protections exist, and does it vary state by state? Is it the same kind of in every state? You can't just go out and kill cats. You know, what legal protections exist for community cats or cats in general? What can these folks do if they have proof or reason to believe that these cats are being harmed?
Yeah, I mean, the cruelty laws in every state, and practically when they are applied down to the county and municipal level, because sometimes they are, they apply to cats. They apply to community cats. They don't apply to, they don't exclude community cats. They don't exclude feral cats. They don't exclude any cat because of the way it acts, looks, or because it's missing a 1/4 inch tip on its ear. None of that applies. So the cruelty laws do apply to community cats all across the country. The problem, I think, came in the last part of your statement is proof. What happens to it? I was in private practice for 15 years in Michigan before I joined Best Friends, and I still get calls to this day from caretakers or folks down in the city who are taking care of cats, and they think or know that someone is trapping their cats, but they don't know what they're doing with them. That's the problem at the prosecutor, at the police department level. You have to prove what that person is doing with them at the end. If they're just simply taking them to the shelter, you're going to have a real hard time, obviously, making any sort of case. But if they're even where the abandonment laws would apply in these situations is what I mentioned earlier. You're trapping a cat and you're taking it to, a park 5 miles away and letting it go over there because there's a group of community cats out there. Or that that's a regular dumping ground for cats. So that is a situation where definitely the abandonment to cruelty laws would apply, depending upon the wording and what was done. But again, proof is the hardest part to deal with. But you got to go to your local prosecutor on it. And whether that may be, depending upon where you're at, it could be the city attorney, it could be the county prosecutor. So depending upon what jurisdiction you're at.
So somebody just said that in their experience, law enforcement considers those nuisance animals, and they're being told that cruelty laws don't apply. But you're saying that's bunk.
Not true at all. I mean, I don't know what state. If you want, Sherry, I see that comment. Sherry, you want to let me know what state that might be? Just to be specific, but it certainly would apply in that case. They can call it quote unquote nuisance animals if they want to, but that's just something that they're calling it.
Yeah, that's always been my understanding too, but I'm really glad to hear you confirm it, that there's not really a law in any state that says it's okay to go outside and kill cats. Like, you can't do that.
It's not, and that's where I'm thinking of certain situations where people, Georgia, it's definitely against the law in Georgia. I am aware of that.
Shame on you having a dog on this cat webinar.
I know.
But there's a follow-up question that I'm happy to take to give you a break from talking for a second. Someone asked, what kind of record keeping is needed to prove to your elected officials that community cat programming works? That is a great question. And we talk a lot about this. So keeping data is monumental to proving that these programs work. And I can't shout it from the rooftops enough that track your data. And if it can be tracked, it should be tracked. So we look at things like your live release rate in the shelter should go up when you implement robust community cat programming. Your died in care numbers should go down. Your length of stay should go down. But you should also start seeing less DOA pickups, less dead upon arrival pickups. So one of the arguments against community cat programming is like, oh, these cats are all going to get killed and eaten by coyotes and run over by cars. And what we see is the opposite. We find less deceased cats in the community when we implement robust community cat programming. So we should be tracking that. You should be tracking, if possible, your nuisance calls coming in, people complaining about stray or outdoor free roaming cats. Track those, see if you see a decline in them. Absolutely anything that you can track should be tracked. And if you want to email me, I've got some amazing data from shelters who have been tracking this for over a decade. And you can see feline deaths plummet and you can see life-saving soar. And so that is all the data that you want to be able to go and smack people over the head with and say, this does work, it does work. And it's working in every state across the country. This is not a newfangled crazy idea coming out of, California. Everybody is doing this now. You're not reinventing the wheel. But that's the kind of data that you want to be keeping. Really anything that you can track should be tracked. And Peter's got some great links that he's throwing in the chat right now on case studies and support for all of that. Okay, are you ready to talk liability?
Sure.
That sounds right up your alley. Okay, animal care and control is always looking at liability first. I don't think that's terribly uncommon for municipal systems. Their belief is that if they help a cat in the community, that they can face legal issues if the cat turns out to be owned rather than unowned. And so I get this question is going to go on, but I get that sometimes too with like, well, if I trap my neighbor's cat and get it fixed, are they going to sue me because now it comes home ear tipped? Has anybody ever been sued successfully for ear tipping a cat that you're aware of?
If there has been, I am not aware of it. And we get these kinds of situations all the time where, you got the question. I'm sure we get the question just as often when we're doing large scale programming. It's an issue that I think it's a phantom issue. That's,
yeah,
people are trying to be extra careful, but yeah, I've not known anyone to be sued. And quite honestly, if they were to be sued, I love my cats, I love my dogs, but the courts are not going to look upon them as being damaged in any way, shape, or form, quite realistically, even if a lawsuit was to be brought. And that's probably why the lawsuits are not brought, quite honestly, because there's no damages in it. And that cat is actually going back. There's an argument to be made that those cats are going back better off than they were before, healthier, vaccinated, sterilized. Yep. And I see a couple of people are talking about laws about having them fixed. Yep. It's always a back and forth one way or the other, but liability, which by the way, is also covered in the report that the ABA did to talk about this very, very issue. So it's only one paragraph, but it gives a good background on the issue as well. But I've not known it to happen at all.
Yeah, good. I haven't either, so I'm glad that we can put that one definitively to rest. Okay, so the question goes on. Our city has a bylaw saying that cats can roam on public property, but not on private property. So you get in trouble for bringing a cat in if you say you trapped it on public property, as all they're concerned with is whether there's a complaint from a property owner against the cat. Our city expects citizens to license their cats. We have no bylaw exemption for unowned roaming cats, and there's no legal protection for people trying to improve the plight of unowned cats. We've also got a legal limit of 6 cats per property, and every one of them has to be licensed. This sounds like a terrible municipality, just FYI. We've tried a number of avenues to work with the city. However, it seems hopeless other than collaborating with property owners. How can we realistically change this climate where we've got cat licensing, we've got a limit of 6 cats, we can trap here, but we can't trap there. Now you can't put them back if you do trap. What do we do?
I think it sounds to me like that person, the person asking the question, has already had some conversations with their local officials, but I think also the logical conclusions that come from what we're talking about. If the one cat, if you can have up to 6 cats on one property and there's 12 between 2 properties and they go back and forth over the property line, or they hop over the fence, or they sleep on one porch one night and one on the other, who's the actual quote unquote owner of that cat? Even if it's probably not in the traditional sense owned. And so who's licensing that cat, quite honestly? And are you required to keep that cat if it's allowed to roam on, if I understood that question correctly, allowed to roam on public property? There's a lot wrong there. And it's just simply logical. So sitting down having in laying out the arguments on logically what might happen. And honestly, talk about the enforcement process. Ask about the impossibility of enforcement that they're asking their municipal and or county employees to go through to try to enforce that ordinance. Because how are they supposed to know if the one cat is at one address one night and sleeps across the street the next night? How are they going to enforce that against who against whom? Who are they issuing the citation to, and who's going to end up showing in court? Which neighbor, which person on that street over that one cat? It's just, I mean, getting down to the impossibilities really of the enforcement of those ordinances might be a good way to try in that situation, just because there's so much that doesn't make sense there.
Yeah, I don't know why some municipalities get stuck on these just stupid laws that are unenforceable, like pet limit laws, or the perfect example. I'm not aware of any city who's got an officer sworn to going around door to door counting cats in your house.
Yeah.
What's the purpose of that? Who's going to pay for that? And it's never enforced, right? Like, you know, unless somebody has it's only enforced like we've been called because there's a known issue and now we can cite you based upon that law. But
it's something that sounded good. They heard or talked to a colleague at a conference who'd done it, and that's what they said they were going to do, whatever it might be. But it's something that sounded good at one point in time, and they didn't realistically think about everything they're asking from their own municipal employees and enforcement staff, right on down to their own constituents that voted them into office, on how to enforce that and what to do. Think about the lack of or waste of resources in that situation, because not only are you putting it on the enforcement staff, you're putting it on the local shelter if they're impounding those animals and bringing them in. It's just, I mean, it's one big, it's a money pit is what it really is. You're wasting resources all over the place. So there are plenty of arguments for that one. But it's a matter of if someone was, I mean, pardon my French, stupid enough to put in that many bad provisions into their ordinances and expect someone to enforce it and people to live by it, logic may not go very far. So I'd be happy to talk to whoever that is if they want to email me afterward and let me know some specifics and I can help them out.
we've got time for another one or two questions. So if you haven't chatted it in, do that now. There's a good one from Jasmine, and she's asking, what makes a cat owned when the cat is free roaming, but someone doesn't fix it or give it medical care when necessary, but they occasionally feed it and feel an affinity for it? So is there some definition of owned? How do we navigate that? I own the cat, I don't own the cat.
Well, this goes back to something I was saying at the beginning, and it's probably a good time to expound on that a little bit. Legal definitions have probably absolutely no relevance to what we may think is an everyday definition or a dictionary definition. So your cat, that cat may be owned under the local ordinance by 5, 6, 10 people, but it has one owner. Maybe it's that owner actually lets it out. That person was the owner of that cat. It may not have any owner. So it really does depend. It's going to depend on your local jurisdiction. How is it defined? If that cat is quote unquote legally owned. If it's your cat and you're caring for it, you technically own it. But what makes it owned is whatever they define it as. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to match the dictionary definition of whatever an actual owner is. The best example I can always give is I know there are several states out there that define a cat as a member of Felis catus that is over 4 months old. And so I'm like, what happened to the ones that are under 4 months? Because they don't define kitten. It's still a cat. It just has no logic behind it, but we understand why they're doing it. It has to do with the rabies vaccination, and that's what they did at the time. But don't assume that the dictionary definition of owner or anything else in your ordinance is going to apply.
This is just really highlights how individual every single one of these cases and ordinances in states and cities really is, right? Like, man, this is a complex web. I remember
one of the other reasons I don't like model ordinance.
Yeah. When I was a fledgling cat trapper in Illinois, I was very fortunate that Leedy lived not far from me, another legislative attorney for best friends, and she was able to help me kind of navigate that process. But she had written into the Illinois statute that if you were participating in a community cat program, you were not an owner of that cat. And I think that was done to protect trappers and caregivers,
Yep.
right?
It absolutely was. Yeah.
Okay, one more question from Robin, and then Richard is going to close us off with giving us some resources and some ideas and ways that you guys can access legal help and get your questions answered. But last question from Robin. The greatest opposition to TNR as an option for managing community cats in our area is coming from birders and wildlife advocates due to the impact community cats are thought to have on bird populations. Well, they think have on bird populations. I'm going to correct that. Are you seeing increased legal barriers built around this argument? If so, can you talk about those barriers a bit and the challenges around this argument? And I could talk about challenges around that argument from a factual point, and so can Peter, who I know is on this call, is that we know that those arguments are incorrect scientifically, but legally, are you seeing more of these arguments being brought up?
You know, legally, you don't see it very often. There have been a few lawsuits. I know there was one in New York a few years ago. I referenced there's a recent, excuse me, habitat conservation plan that was put into place in the county of Kauai, on the islands of Hawaii a few years ago. So when you're calling it a legal argument, yes, sometimes there are lawsuits brought, and I think the one in New York was definitely settled. It was brought against the New York Park State Department, and it was just an absolutely ridiculous lawsuit, but it was one of those ones where they pushed it and they had some pretty high-powered attorneys behind them that were pushing it forward, and the state didn't want to fight it. So it did get settled, but we are seeing some, I wouldn't say we're seeing more legal challenges of it, but it's usually the same thing, whether they're bringing it up under the Endangered Species Act or the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, those sorts of things. But you don't see actual lawsuits actually being brought and filed, because that costs money. Yeah.
And if you're looking for those resources on how do we combat the ecology minded or the conservationists and whatnot, not that we want to combat them, but if you want the resources and studies and science that we have behind cats versus birds, I just dropped my email into the chat, so don't hesitate to email me and we will be happy to get that to you. But so with only a couple of minutes left, Richard, where can people go to find help and get some questions answered, to get resources? Is there online materials for folks? Where can they go?
I always push. One of the resources that I don't think a lot of people know about is called the National Feline Research Council, and I think Peter has put a few links to studies there on it. It's really, really good for very short, broken down. Why are feeding bans bad? Why is cat licensing bad? Like you mentioned, there's a lot of good resources there as well for what we were just talking about as far as the potential wildlife arguments that have come up, and it's all put together by experts. It's a compilation of the studies that we see that talk about these things and that we are able to utilize to show there's not 4.5 billion birds being killed by cats every year, which is what we hear almost all the time. So that's one of the resources that I want to point to. One of the other resources that I like to use, I've already mentioned, it's the ABA resolution. And when I say that, the resolution itself is only about five lines long, but there's a 14-page report that was written by a lot of folks who are on the Animal Law Tips Committee under the ABA, including Joan Schaffner from George Washington University School of Law. Huge community cat advocate. Very, very well done. It's an absolute resource when you're talking to policymakers. There was another recent collaboration that includes some things on community cats we at Best Friends did with the International Municipal Lawyers Association that you should be able to find as well, that talks about community supported sheltering. And obviously some of the Haas website has plenty of resources as well that we're talking about. There are just so many resources out there nowadays. It's hard. I feel bad even mentioning specific ones because I know I left out some good ones. I know I mentioned Alley Cat Allies earlier as well. So I mean, you can go on and on with the resources depending upon what you need. And I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. If anybody wants to, feel free to reach out. If they have any further questions or specifics or want to talk more about what answers we may have given tonight.
That's so wonderful. Thank you both so much. This has been really great. I've learned a ton myself, and I'm sure other people have as well. We will keep track of those questions, and Monica and Richard will be following up if they did not get to your question. We really appreciate all of your time, and this webinar was recorded and will be available in 3 days. So probably early next week if you are looking for the recording. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks to Maddie's Fund.
Thanks, everyone.